Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. There's a theme in the air. There's a sort of intermingling of practices and discourses that has seized my mind and the minds of many folks that I know of late, and that is how the encounter, heretical, bizarre, inappropriate as it may be, at least according to some people, but how the encounter of Buddhism and contemporary psychedelic culture is going to transform both of these zones, as well as the people exploring this overlap. I think I've probably mentioned on the show where when the new edition of Zigzag Zen, the first book on Buddhism and psychedelics, was reissued, we got together and did an event at Spirit Rock, and we had done an event at Spirit Rock for the first edition, which was well over a decade ago, and of course the book featured an essay of mine about looking at psychedelics within Western Buddhism as a kind of tantra, in the sense that it was secret, a bit forbidden, looked down upon by some as being tawdry or overly magical, and of course has within it a sort of dynamics of energy and vision that is not, generally speaking, unrelated to aspects of tantra. Anyway, when we got together again recently for the second edition, the change in the crowd and the change in the conversation was remarkable. It is as if we had moved on to a new generation, a new set of questions, where it was no longer about, is it appropriate to bring Buddhism and psychedelics together as a possible site of exploration of spiritual practice. That in some sense was a given, at least for the crowd there, even though, of course, some people are still not interested in this from within the Buddhist community, especially. But basically, it wasn't really, that wasn't the question anymore. We weren't talking about the fifth precept. Is that really, how can you take psychedelics and still follow the precepts, et cetera, et cetera? There was something else in the room, which was a more pressing question of, what do we do with this now? How do we move forward with it? And it seems to me like it's a pressing question at the moment, amidst all the more overt and gruesome pressing questions of our historical moment. Nonetheless, it's worth pursuing. And tomorrow I'll be speaking with Vincent Horn of the revamped Buddhist Geeks podcast, and we'll be talking about Buddhism and psychedelics. And I'm also going to continue the conversation today with a wonderful woman that I met when I visited Israel earlier this year. I gave the keynote at the first Israeli conference on psychedelics, which unfortunately I was mostly unable to understand since it was in Hebrew, not one of my very, very few languages. But it was a wonderful scene nonetheless, and I met a lot of great persons, including Galia Tanay, who's practiced Buddhism for a very long time in a rather strict fashion, which we'll hear about, and has been doing it for almost 20 years, has a PhD in psychology, and currently works as a therapist, a teacher of meditation, and a psychedelic activist. And we had wonderful conversations, and it was so nice to sort of that there's a wonderful feeling when you kind of resonate with somebody who's from a different scene and sort of, different background in many ways. But then finding ourselves really having a wonderful set of questions and even a few answers, I suspect. So I wanted to bring her back on the show and talk to her. So Galia, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Thank you, Erik. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, so I thought one place we might start is I'd just like to hear again the story of how you became, how you sort of entered into Dharma practice, and
Right.
what led you into the depths of of that work, which you practiced pretty seriously for a while, just as a way to getting your own story about how these two
Right.
zones became together.
All right. So, it's a really, I think, a kind of classical story. I was suffering a lot as a teenager, and in Israel, there is this very common thing to do is to go traveling, right? After you finish your military service. Never mind, maybe we'll talk about that later. But so I went to India, like many young Israelis. And somehow it was very popular to just go on a Goenka retreat there, like this 10 days Vipassana retreat. And I entered my first retreat in Jaipur. I was about 20 years old. And at the end of this 10 days, I was very determined, and I said, okay, I found my path. It was a very clear understanding for me once I started to practice that for me, this was a really, really very beneficial, very straight, very clear way of finding somehow a path of out of something that I was struggling with for a long time as a teenager girl. Mostly depression, but I think most of it was a lot of existential questions, and also growing up in this capitalist whatever. We'll touch upon that later, but I really looked for something different. It was a very, very obvious that this quest is very deep, and I should really dive into it. And luckily, in the Goenka system, for those who knows it, is like a very constructed and a very they have a very structured manner. You have to do this and this amount of 10 days retreat, and then you need to go on a longer time retreat. And I wanted to immediately go and do a 30 days retreat. I went out of the 10 days and I said, okay, this is the thing. I want to sit now and for as long as I can. And
Well, one question was, how much do you think that part of the intensity you felt, like the sense that this is it, like this is what I want, and you plunged right into it, has to do with coming out of that military experience? Because when I went to India in the mid 1990s to write about the psytrance scene that was just sort of emerging into the world stage from Goa.
Right.
And when I went there were travelers, from all over the place, from UK, from France, from Germany, from Italy, from America. But everybody agreed that the craziest psychedelic travelers at that point were the Israelis. And part of the reason, even then, people said, well, they come out. I mean, what do you think? 3 years in the service for guys, 2 years for women. I think that's what it is. And,
Right.
it's no joke. It's not like you're just, helping old ladies cross the street. So there's this sort of sense, like there must be this incredible kind of urgency and sense of intensity that I think, like, if for me, going there, well, maybe a little Buddhism, okay, a little bit partying over here. I didn't have as much drive, even though I was a seeker, definitely at that point in my life. So I'm kind of curious how much of it was also just this desire to do something totally different and to get out of that framework.
So I think, like every story, there are several different narratives that can be told here, right? The first one is, the military service was just the outer structure. I think, like many Buddhist practitioners, I was coming out of great deal of suffering. Most of it was mental. Most of it was like inner struggle and a very, very deep sense of desperation, and seeing the suffering in the world, and just being, in a way, being very, very sensitive and open to reality, which is, of course, when you serve in the army, you see it more closely, but I already saw it even before I became, part of this military, whatever. I think many Buddhist practitioners, I find, that really dive into the practice come out of great deal of suffering. And their own personal suffering is becoming a very, very strong motive that pushes them to to seek a very deep and very transformative practice. So this is one narrative. But another narrative that is also important for me to say, because I think it does have a lot of meaning for me personally, is that when I sat there in these 10 days, I all the time had the feeling that I'm just home, that I already know that this is that I've already been practicing this, and it seems familiar to me, and it's like the natural and most organic place for me to be. It didn't feel like I need to push myself to go on a 30 days retreat. It just felt like, okay, finally I found where I need to be, where I belong to. And I think this sense was also a really, really strong part of my full, letting go into this Buddhist identity, that maybe later I'll talk a little bit about how the seeking for the original practice, right? Because I was at that point very, very keen on finding the original traditional, way of practice and just do it like the Buddha taught. I was very young and very naive, and I really, really wanted to follow the Buddha's, footsteps. So I think
And
this two
you really
narrative
dove in. You really dove in for quite a long time
completely,
of applied
completely.
practice. Well, how far out did you get? I mean, what kind of, were you getting to a place where you thought, hey, maybe enlightenment is just around the corner. I've found the right path.
Completely. I was, I shaved my head and I did like this months and months retreats. I joined into a center of the Mahasi tradition, which is a Burmese, very popular Burmese meditation tradition that was taught by Mahasi Sayadaw, which was one of the greatest teachers of the 20th century. And I really, really thought at that point that I can eradicate all mental defilements from my consciousness. I had a very, very naive and very pure kind of faith in the teaching, because I just, as I said, I was really young, and my kind of my motive was to become fully liberated, and fully not enlightenment was never exactly the thing that I was, the word or the concept that really somehow pulled me, but I really wanted to eradicate greed, hatred, and delusion completely from my mind. And I really thought that it was possible for me, And so I wanted to become a nun, and for 6 years I practiced the layman's the precepts very, very strictly, for long periods of time. I lived like a semi-monastic life, and didn't completely go to any kind of entertainment things, and really, really, I would say, renounced a lot of from the world and from activities that I did before. And I really tried to embody and to practice in a very, very traditional and pure and strict and austere, even I would say, way. So this was a really, and I'm really happy for this time, because I think it was a really deep and very profound experience of what the human mind is able to, how the human mind is able to transform in different kind of mental states and things born out of this kind of very, very intense practice of months and months. I'm speaking about, 16 hours of meditation a day from 4 a.m. until 10 p.m. You're constantly, even if you're walking or eating or taking a shower, you're all the time extremely mindful, extremely slow, extremely attentive to every kind of sensation, physical or mental, that is going on. And this intense practice has a lot of benefits, of course. It teaches you a lot about the mind, and I'm really, really happy for that period of time. Also, I had the privilege of having a teacher, that was really teaching in his dharma talks a lot of the sutras. So I was really exposed to the traditional way of studying the sutras and the abhidhamma, and this had been the foundation. Basically, I feel that this has been the foundation of my choices, and even in many ways of different other paths that I've taken later in my life, because I did this very, very intense period of time of
well, particularly
traditional,
yeah, that kind of studying. I mean, it's, one thing if the tradition was, Nyingma Buddhism, Vajrayana, it would have been very different. But studying the Abhidharma, and the Abhidharma in many ways is even though the specifics are very different, if you read it from a contemporary psychological point of view, you can go, oh, this is just pretty good psychology. I mean, it's just a way of breaking down the mind into these sort of subcomponents and habits, and a very kind of in some ways almost merciless deconstruction of our ordinary sense of self. So it actually kind of leads, I can see how that would lead then to getting a PhD in psychology and developing that, a more contemporary view, let's say, of our, psychological predicament. It doesn't seem as much of a rupture. But given how far you were into it, how did you, I don't know what the verb is, fall out, find your way, back to the secular world, or what? And how
I'm not a secular person at all.
You're a mystic.
I'm not considering myself a secular person at all. I'm not Buddhist in any way, but I'm not a secular person. But what you said about psychology is really interesting, because I remember doing my undergraduate studies, and there was this course about perception, right? Western research of perception, of how the eye and the nervous system and so on. And I remember sitting there and looking at what the professor was talking about, and saying to himself, this is strictly Abhidharma, the contact, all the phases of how contacted the eye door and so on. It was really exactly like you said. It was a very beautiful mirroring of this very, almost, how would I say it? Like, deconstruction in a way which is very not a mystical way, not taking any kind of whatever the ideas or that you don't have to believe anything. It's just trying to really describe the human activity, the human behavior, the human perception in terms which is very clear. So when I started to study psychology, I had this dream of, actually when I really started, I wanted to be a brain researcher. At the beginning, I thought I would study biology and do fMRI studies and stuff like this. So this was the beginning of my academic studies. But soon enough, I understood that really what interests me the most is just being in contact with people and translating the dharma, or the thing that I practiced in the East or in Nepal and so on, to somehow to bring them back home. And specifically, I had this very direct personal mission of finding ways to work with depressed people, because I was coming out of very severe major depression as a teenage, and finding a way to apply the dharma and to apply the things that I was practicing and that I was taught to people in the West that suffer from depression. And so eventually I found myself doing like all this clinical training, clinical psychology training, and my PhD was already, fortunately enough, focused on mindfulness, that had just started to become popular in Israel when I started to work on it. It was really in the beginning. Now it's really huge. I think we are about almost maybe 10 years later than the States in this field. But so I had the real luck, because when I started my PhD, I found the place and the lab that could really support mindfulness research. And so when I did my PhD, I was already actually teaching meditation, even I would say teaching like some form of the Mahasi tradition in a very, very narrow, in a very, very secular, as you say, form, but to people that I would never meet in other kind of contexts. So like students or patients or things like this. So this was really a great privilege, because I could start even during my PhD to merge and to find the interrelations between this world of of psychology, of research, of empirical research, and so on, and my more traditional, in the lack of other word, traditional practice. So this is really.
What drew you away from the traditional practice, from your plans of being a nun and that degree of devotion?
What took me away? I fell in love.
There you go. That's a beautiful answer.
Yeah, actually, that was the first step, of course. But I think as I grew up, slowly, I started to realize that what I thought of as my goal or my mission is not exactly what I want for myself in this life, you know? And the idea of, I think some people really like to live a monastic life, and it's really fitting them, and it's really the thing that they should do. For me, it was never the case. I remember coming to my teacher and saying to him, I want to become a nun in Burma, and he was looking at me and he said to me, please wait a couple of years. I was really young, so please wait a couple of years, because he saw me. He knew it was not exactly the way I should actualize the Dharma in my life. And I think step by step, what became clearer and clearer is that the way for me to actualize, the way for me to manifest this great and profound teaching was different, was to find a way which is not trying to repeat, I would say, trying to recreate something that is my idea of how the traditional way looks like, but to become this bridge, or I always think of myself as a translator, or a bridge, the way that I can meet people from all paths, all walks of life, all kind of different identities, all kind of different classes of society, working with really very, very different people from each other. This, I think, started to become more and more clear for me. So, and I think the studies of psychology and the clinical work, and being in mental hospitals and meeting people that are actually really, really suffering and they really need help. This gave me a lot of food for thought, because the Buddhist, again, I'm sorry to repeat this word, but I just don't have another word for it. But the traditional Buddhist practice, the way it's perceived in the West, even more so, is not fitting at all for people who suffer like from mental illness or from depression and anxiety and so on. It's not possible for a person who is now struggling with whatever, a psychotic crisis or a PTSD or so on. It's not a possible thing for him to go on a meditation retreat. And still, I think the Dharma has a lot to offer, and we see it all the time with the really great wave of mindfulness. Even I would say the revolution of mindfulness practice everywhere, right?
Well, talk a little about that, since you've been working in that for so long, and you've seen, you've had a front seat at watching how at least Israeli society has absorbed mindfulness and brought it into contact with other practices and other institutions. And of course, that's happening throughout the West in all sorts of ways that are almost kind of dizzying at this point, seeing how far it has gone. What are some of your feelings now about how it's developed? Is there, on the one hand, it's a very successful example of taking aspects of Buddhism and taking it away from a traditional, somewhat alien context and bringing it into a place where ordinary people who are facing ordinary suffering, but sometimes great suffering, can avail themselves of these tools. And yet, as we see the thing go forward, and as we see, capitalism as it is, and institutions as they are absorbing these teachings, as the picture gets more complicated. And I'm curious how you see mindfulness now in terms of how it's developed and how it relates, or increasingly maybe doesn't relate with certain aspects of traditional Buddhism that seem important.
Right. So actually, this question brings me to this term that I'm very busy with lately, which is like the idea of selfing, right? So how does a certain practice or a certain way of thinking or so on is actually enhancing and creating your sense of conceptual self, right? And I think that what happens a lot in the mindfulness movement, unfortunately, is that because it's really becoming more and more entangled and immersed in this, how would I call it, this well-being, whatever, capitalist self-improvement wave, which is also has to do a lot with the way the New Age had made the ancient spiritual practices and tradition into basically a product, right? So I think that one thing that is really, really, I would say, makes me a little bit, I don't know how to exactly say it, but makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable is the way that people actually use this practice for this selfing process. So instead of a practice that makes you feel, I would say, more interconnected, more in deep care for the world and each other, it is narrowing down into this idea of stress reduction or self-improvement. And so it creates this idea, it creates this image of how a mindfulness practitioner is supposed to be or supposed to look like. And again, I'm a mindfulness therapist and a mindfulness teacher, and I teach therapists, and I see the great benefits of this wave. I see the beautiful and inspiring and deep processes that people go through when they just actually start to sit quietly and observe their sensations, emotions, and so on. So this is really, really self-evident. I don't need to discuss this, okay? So the critical perspective I'm bringing it just because, not because there are no value or I don't see the beauty and so on, but because I think looking from this critical perspective is really important if we really want to, and I think it has to do also a lot with this meeting point between the psychedelic practice and the Buddhist practice or mindfulness practice and so on. Because if we look at it from this selfing perspective, we can ask about a certain process. Okay, does this help a person become more free of this outer structures and ideas of how he or she is supposed to be and how he or she is supposed to behave and look like, and what emotions are, I would say, right, okay, or even allowed in a sense. Because as a therapist, I work a lot with a method which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's one of my favorite translations of the Dharma into the Western mind or the Western therapeutic or clinical work. And one main point they keep stressing out, we keep stressing out in this way of working is, what is your conceptualized self? What is your idea of who you are? And how this idea is all the time is keep limiting you and pushing you, and in a way it's becoming this tyranny inside, and unfortunately I find a lot of the mindfulness processes, when they are done, I would say, when they are done in a very self-improvement style, okay, I would say it like this, it just creates more ideas like that. It just enhances the conceptualized self. It just pushes people to say, okay, I'm not supposed to look angry. I'm not supposed to feel so judgmental, and it's very paradoxical because the messages are very, very beautiful. Of course, anger is painful. Of course, when we are angry, we suffer. That's just a fact of life. But it's really easy to make it a product that promises you that if you will consume enough of this product, you will not feel angry anymore, or you will not look in this and that sense, or you will not be judgmental and so on. And there, I think we encounter a real fault, I would say,
Yeah,
of
I
this
think
treatment.
yeah, that's very well said. It's like there's a certain regulative ideal of the self that you develop, and you can even sense it around people. There's a kind of, as if there's a buffer, so that mindfulness and meditation practice, and as you learn how to detach or observe the self, or recognize that feelings are just events happening in the body that you don't need to tell a story about. All of these wonderful insights that certainly helped me become a much less depressed person in resonance with your story, and to some degree a less angry one. But at
Anger
the
is a
same
bitch, huh?
yeah, at the same time, you get the sense, and you meet people, and it's like they're well buffered. You can tell, like, it's
Yes,
hard to, like, they've got their internal gravity, but it's kind of at the cost of encountering the world, of being interdependent in a way that maybe is different than the old reactivity, but is also still, very engaged. And so you get these people
right,
who are kind of, they have like a blanket around them of this kind of smiling ease, that in some ways is genuine, but also seems like kind of a trap in a way, a kind of loss. So anyway, I think you described that very well. And so I think the obvious question then is to ask, when you started to look at or become interested in psychedelics as something that could come into this process of selfing, or could become part of a way of adopting aspects of the Dharma and avoiding some of these problems, or bringing them, together. And so it wasn't just that you had a personal interest in psychedelics; it's you started
right,
to see that they had this real potential in a different way than the kind of map studies that we've seen about PTSD and blah blah blah. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about something, I think, a lot subtler, about how you work with the self as it begins to change, as it begins to unlearn its old patterns. There's still, lots of places to go, and and and,
right.
and so I'd love to hear how you started to reframe psychedelics from the perspective that you're coming from.
Right. So maybe the first one that really pushed me to this direction, not personally, because unfortunately I didn't meet him yet, was Gary Snyder. So I read this Dharma Bum's book by Kerouac, and then I really dived into Snyder's writing, and somehow something about this encounter really woke me up, and I felt very, very vividly that in many parts of myself, I put them to sleep, and that this is not the purpose of what I want to practice. As you don't even have to call it Dharma, right? I just really want to be awake. I want to really be as free, as liberated, as loving, as interconnected as I possibly can in this world. And when I started to look at his writing and to see this kind of freedom that comes out of the the willingness to really experience life, to really, really experience life. And it has a lot to do, it's not a chance, it's not just a mistake or some kind of fault that so many Zen masters have so many wine songs, right? And they were writing endlessly about how they become drunk and look at the moon, and how they drink more wine and drink more wine. Something about this, I would say, this deep acceptance, or this deep willingness to say, okay, it's forbidden, but I do it. It's not even like an idea of if it's good or if it's bad, because when I do it, something happens to me that is beyond my usual sense of who I am and what I am, and I let go in a different way. And this helps me to let go in many levels, even after I become sober, right? I think about, many Zen poets that I really love that all the time drink and write poems about wine and so on. So after this push, I just said, okay, I agree. And it was around me. And I started to experiment with mind altering substances. And in the beginning, I remember that I said to myself, gosh, how do people do this stuff without like months and months of retreats? I just didn't understand how they can handle this intensity without the mental training that I had been through, because it was so intense for me. And I said, okay, this mental training is really the best kind of how would I say, workout before before you go into this outer spaces of psychedelics. But step by step, from experimenting with my own mind and from starting to get to know this working with these substances in different communities and so on, I started to look at the potential of these substances to really bring people into touch, into deep kind of touch with experience, and to open realms of mental states, and to open realms of livelihood. I don't know exactly how to describe, but to really bring them in contact with things that previously they were unable to come in touch with. And I think that in this sense, psychedelic is a very, very, very strong gate, a very, very strong I don't want to reduce it into the word mechanism, but it's some kind of technology, you can call it whatever you like, but that really help you to come in touch with different realms and different levels and different parts of your experience, which are in a way, for many of us, it's almost impossible to come in touch with without the help of this medicine plants or substances or molecules, or you name it, whatever you like.
Yeah.
And so
go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I think that when I started to really learn and to experiment with these different substances, I started to understand that different things that had been conceptually clear to me, for example, compassion is a very good example. Okay, I feel that the way that I embody compassion today is deeply, deeply connected to my work with the medicine, right? And that I could have never come in touch with these levels and this depth of compassion, which are in me now and has always probably been in me in a way, as much as there is a me. But I could have not come in touch with them without the really generous and beautiful help of the medicine.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to just pause for a moment, because I think it's a good example. People think about psychedelics. Maybe they give you crazy visionary experience of other realms, or they introduce experiences of bliss, or they introduce experiences of great terror. But one of my more recent experiences being having been doing a lot more meditation recently over the last few years, and having the opportunity to drink ayahuasca in Brazil, discovering very much what you said, like it's almost hard for me to imagine how someone would do ayahuasca in particular, to my mind, even in comparison with other psychedelics. And not have a dharma practice, because it was just very clear immediately that the appropriate way to respond and navigate the space drew from the same set of tools and attitudes that I had developed in meditation, in retreats, and in a daily practice. But more than that was how my own difficulties, my own psychological issues, became bound up with much more universal problems, meaning, things that are inherent to human experience, things that are inherent to being an animal on a planet, things that are inherent to being in history with all of these large scale forces that were already going before I arrived and will keep going after me. And
Right.
that because of the visionary capacity, I was able to sort of not leapfrog over my own suffering, but see the way that my own suffering was bound up intimately and directly into the great mass of suffering that is the human lot, and maybe even beyond the human lot, and having to deal with that. So what are you going to do? Am I going to hide? Am I going to let it steamroller me? Am I just going to embrace it or try to tune my heart to that mass? Like that challenge in the ceremony has definitely shifted the way in which I deal with my own ordinary daily sufferings, because I see them in a different framework. And it's also one where I recognize that there's no escape. There's no easy escape. I keep having a line in my head that's coming up throughout this conversation about something Trungpa wrote about the sort of, Dharma warrior position, is that you have an ever more tender broken heart. And that idea of moving into the broken heart, but being incredibly tender as in a way the only response to this massive suffering, it was profoundly revelatory as a mode of compassion. And again, like you say, outside of that context, it's hard to make that leap. You can recognize intellectually, oh, my suffering is like other people's suffering. My issues are general as well. But it's a lot harder to, kind of have to raise the oomph to meet it outside of that particular context. So I think that's a wonderful example of a place where the practices, if you will, can feed each other.
Right. And, it's really the second term I thought about before our discussion that I'm dealing with and like busy with lately. And also, it comes from the same acceptance and commitment frame of mind, is avoidance, and mainly experiential avoidance. So I think that what you describe is really, really touching upon this point, because as human beings, we have this fields of experiences, physical sensations, emotions, or thoughts that we are not willing to come in touch with. That we say, no, this is unbearable. This I cannot stand. Okay. And mostly when I work as a therapist, when I do transformative and healing work with people, we try to find the boundaries of this space of the avoidant mechanism that you develop, and to try together to touch these parts. And for many people, for most of us in a way, it is so difficult to do. It is so difficult to do. And in a solitary meditation practice, sitting by yourself on your cushion, I find that much of it is coming up and much of it is not. Some people describe how they went into a meditation retreat and then they remember a trauma that they didn't remember for many years and so on, or they met this and that experiences that were really difficult for them and so on. But many of the people, and in this sense, I think that traditional Buddhist practice can also become a mechanism for avoiding, just like what you said before about the blanket. Okay, so people can actually use the practice in order to somehow take themselves away from experiences that they don't want to experience, or it's too difficult for them, or is too close, or it's too bleeding, And working with the medicine in many ways makes you, like, forces you sometimes very violently to come in contact with whatever it is that you're avoiding, and to come in contact which is not conceptual contact. I'm translating now this Krishnamurti Freedom of the Known essay, and there is a beautiful line there where he says, if you see a tree and you say, oh, this is an oak tree or a banyan tree, the words come between you and the tree, because to know the tree, you have to put your hand on it, you know? And I think in many ways, in meditation practice, we really try diligently to go over this conceptual mind and to really come in contact with what it is to be this stream of ever-changing, interconnected, you know, physicality and mentality and materiality and so on, the mind and so on. But all the time our conceptual mind is automatically coming into the picture, and if we are very well trained, sometimes it's just so subtle that we don't even see it anymore, you know. And when we drink ayahuasca or when we eat mushrooms and so on, these agents themselves, in a way, and here we come into this question of, is this an entity, is this a being, or what is this, and so on. But something about this ancient teachers, this ancient curanderos and so on, is really making people come in touch with experiences, sensations, emotions, and stories and so on, that they kept away, that they kept avoiding sometimes for many, many years. And this is why even very, very old-time practitioners, and I know several that are starting to have psychedelic experiences, they feel that something new has opened to them. You know, that in a sense their practice has deepened or has become richer in a way, or that they found support for their practice, even if it's just one experience, because this way of touching the tree and not calling it an oak tree, or, you know, really experiencing your non-self in a very I don't know how to say it exactly, but in a way which is very raw. Maybe this is what I would say: very fresh, very raw, very deep into this actualization. I think this is,
and also
yeah,
very mucky. Like we talked before, we were saying one of the I think a trap that contemporary Dharma practitioners can fall into, whether or not they're following a very traditional path or a more modern, psychologized kind of Dharma practice, that with an emphasis on sort of self-improvement or whatever, is that there's it can become very dry and very sort of pure, very, very purist. You know, it's like in the 60s and 70s, they
even
talked about people,
Puritan, right,
yeah,
right,
going on a purity trip, you know, and you can, you know, definitely see that. And that was one of the things that came up when I was first part of the dialogue around psychedelics and Buddhism, and you know, starting 15 years ago or 20 years ago. There was a lot of resistance because people were like, no, that was then. Now we're kind of refined. We're above that. And I always like the greasy kid stuff aspect of psychedelics. I think I like the way that there's a crazy, tacky, weird, messy, gross, bizarre aspect to it. Not because I think that those are the most important elements in life, but because I think those are qualities that help undermine or mix our tendencies towards that kind of mind of purism or kind of clarity or being like above it all. And so you have no choice but to dive into the muck, into your body, into fear, into your your intestines. If it's ayahuasca, you know, it's like you have no escape, no easy escape, even if your mind is able to really recognize and be with the experience.
Right. And from my own personal experience and practice, this gives you a mastery in the sense that if you're willing to dance, if you're willing to really dance with these parts of your human being, you know, if you are willing not only to experience them or to be ashamed of them or to try to become this pure whatever image of Buddha sitting beautifully, but if you have this practice of of being this weird and coming into this different forms. We spoke before about being like this dancing goddess in a trance party, right? So having this freedom to move between these identities, having the freedom to be around people vomiting and whatever, working with spirits of great rage and fear, and working with very dark and very frightening parts of whatever, how you call it, even if you call it spirits or if you see it as archetypes which you embody at this moment. But I think something about this freedom actually makes you a much cleaner person in a way, because all the time we see that when people try to whatever make the impression that they're very pure, okay, if people try to limit and to push away the shadow part, it will come out in another way, and usually a much more destructive way. If we hate it, if we try to eliminate it completely, if we try to deny it, this is a very basic principle. It will come out in a way which is much more destructive. I see it very strongly in my personal life, right? And once I'm willing to dance with these forces, with the Kali inside, with this dark goddess, which is also a part of me, and some people probably has different parts. They don't all have to be this, Kali devotees, yeah? But if you do have these forces within you, and each and every one of us has difficult and beautiful, but really difficult and painful forces within. I think something about this weird and just like how you described it, this mucky quality really gives you the full acceptance and the full space to learn how to dance with these parts. And I find that this is a really great gift that is coming out of this medicine work, especially for Buddhist practitioners.
Yeah, I think especially for Buddhist practitioners, this is true, that it's one thing to have an abstract psychological idea about integrating your shadow or developing compassion for the parts of you that are wounded, and it's another thing to be looking into a terrifying insect being that is, filling you full of paranoia or terrible fear, and those domains, they're part of the weave, they're part of the picture. If we're in the afterlife, go ahead.
Right. I have to say about this that we didn't discuss at all, but there is a really, really strong element of what kind of relationships you have with others in this sense. Because when a shaman or when a group of people is holding you, right, in this experience, when you are working with others and you are allowing yourself to show these parts of you in the presence of others, is very, very different than to sit silently with your back very erect and to just contain. It's two completely different way of self-regulation, right? And I think we must put a great emphasis on the relationship part, which in the medicine work is a very, very beautiful thing. It really gives you a practice of intimacy and the practice of interdependence and the practice of trust that is very, very challenging, but is really, really deep and can be so profoundly therapeutic for all of us, I think.
I think that's very beautiful. I mean, one of the ways I think about it is that we're all partly made of pathology, however you want to think about pathology, and right. That one of the psychedelics are amazing and sometimes even can be dangerous for certain people because of the way in which it sort of revitalizes and reframes pathological sides of ourselves. Right. And that can be very difficult, but I think you're incredibly correct, and I had never really thought about it this way before, is that something happens when you are able to share or be in the space of your own pathology within a larger container that is made up of other people who are intimate with that process or have gone through it themselves, and being able to be that way in group, in relationship, even if it's in informal situations. I mean, I'm thinking of many, informal crazy party situations, not necessarily structured ayahuasca groups, but it's really about the way in which people can witness and hold each other in their pathology that changes your own relationship to that side of yourself.
And I think in this sense, this is a very radical movement that, as you said, a trans party can be a very, very radical movement in this sense, because it is really giving you a very, very strong sense of freedom to just become and to actualize. It can not, of course, not all trans parties and so on, but it can be a very, very unique in our society, in our capitalistic and strict and narrowing society that keeps all the time telling you how you should look and how you should feel and how you should behave. And all the time, the external authority is really, really pressing you down. These spaces can be very, very special, because they really give you, in the presence of other, the feeling that you are just very free to actualize and to manifest as you are right now. And for me, this was a really great gift, and it helped me going out into the world and going to meet people which are not at all related into this kind of communities and so on, with a much greater freedom, with a much greater inner space to move, and to be and to take different forms, and not to have to cling all the time to one identity or to protect any kind of identity. And for me as a teacher, you don't even need to call it the Dharma teacher, because I'm really not sure that this captures exactly all the width of what I'm trying to embody in my life. But I think this gave me a lot of perspective on how we walk in this world, and also as a Buddhist practitioner, how I used to walk in the world, and what kind of external authority I pushed on myself as a result of my own practice. So
that's all wonderfully said. It's a shame we have to wind it down here. I mean, I had a feeling this was going to go really fast, and I have a bunch of other questions and comments I'd love to make. I mean, as I said at the beginning, this seems like a very rich point of overlap right now, and that to boil it, to maybe not sounds too utopian, but just that I think psychedelics might be able to help mindfulness move on to another phase. But anyway, Galia, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thank you. It was great.
Okay, well, I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Until next week, keep your minds open.